Okay, so today we're going to actually read chapter 3, or part of chapter 3 of this book, and it's called More Than a Deficit. Here we go. Today we're going to talk about two models of disability, the medical model and the social model. I'm talking loudly, pronouncing each word with precision and care, and using my hands to push invisible ideas through the air as a group of high school seniors find places for their backpacks, lean back in their chairs, and whisper loudly to each other about whatever important events happened since they saw each other a few hours ago. I try to signal that we're getting started by ignoring the buzz and diving in. Sitting in my wheelchair, I'm at eye level with them, and some have to crane their necks to see me as I push myself back and forth in front of the class. When I talk about models of disability, I say, I want you to imagine that each model is like a different set of glasses you put on. I place an imaginary set of spectacles on the bridge of my nose. One set of lenses draws out a particular set of details, while the other set reveals something entirely different. During my time in graduate school, I'd given a handful of lectures and presentations on these ideas to college students and academic peers, but this is my first time teaching high schoolers, my first time teaching a disability focused class, my first time seeing a group of kids 5 days a week as we work through this material. 1 month after I defended my dissertation on disability studies and creative nonfiction, I took this job teaching English at an independent high school. I hadn't been in a high school classroom since I was a student in one, well over a decade before, and I had never been a student in a high school that expected as much from its students. I was recklessly breaking the unspoken rules of the community. Don't assign seniors a paper so close to their college application deadlines. Don't write page long comments on report cards. Don't take it personally. And the silent, consistently reinforcing values succeeding, winning, perfecting, more, higher, better, best. Instead, my headspace was entirely wrapped up in the work I devoted myself to over the previous 3 years, reading and breathing, writing and dreaming about disability theory, working with texts that felt as supernaturally powerful to me as the Bible had when I was a fervent teenager. By the time I graduated, I saw myself as the chosen disciple who would go forth and teach the people with the truth I'd been given. I was confident that the rampant ableism I felt coursing through the world would be remedied rather simply through education. The problem was just that people didn't receive a clear presentation of the right information. And wouldn't you know, I had that information. We were so close to revelation. One of the greatest appeals of the job was the ability to design my own semester course for the seniors. I spent the rest of the summer dreaming it up. Cripples, freaks, and invalids, the marginalizing body as seen in the stories we tell. I marveled at my great luck in finding a job where I could fulfill my purpose so directly. I agonized over cuts to the reading list and crafted the perfect activities that would allow my future students to really experience the content of the course. I was a bit intimidated to teach this particular group of teenagers. Our school was known for producing the very highest standardized test scores and sending its students off to all the Ivy Leagues. I wondered that they'd chew, I worried they'd chew through disability studies too quickly and that I'd run out of ideas from them to think through. So, the medical model and the social model, two sets of lenses that show you the same scene in different ways. One lens, the medical model, is the default set. This is the way we typically look at disability, the way we've looked at disability for a really long time. When you see through this lens, You immediately see the disabled body as a problem that needs to be fixed. I click to a slide with a rough sketch of a woman in a wheelchair sitting at the bottom of a flight of stairs. She looks haggard and frazzled. Her hair is a bit of a mess. In the back of my mind, I wonder whether my students see me in this image, helpless, powerless, ineffectual. But I don't have time to reflect on it. This isn't about me. This is about giving them some new ideas to try on. Approached using the medical model, this woman in her wheelchair are the only problem that needs fixing. This perspective fixates on the deficiencies in the individual. Maybe there's a cure for her legs. Maybe we can figure out a way to get her upright so she can walk up those stairs. Or maybe she should just try to find another building. I slap my hand against her illustrated legs, my own paralyzed legs resting be- beneath hers on my wheelchair's footplate. This explanation seems to make easy sense to them. The medical model feels obvious. What other way is there to look at it? But the social model sees this scene differently, I explain, excited to share the big reveal, a shift in perspective that had changed everything for me. Instead of fixating on disability as the problem, the social model focuses on the experience of the disability, the context of the disability, the environments creating disabling moments. The social model looks at this image and says, let's shift our focus from the woman in the wheelchair to the building with only one point of access. How limiting! The soul model says, let's build a ramp, an elevator. Let's redesign this building with fewer stairs. And while we're at it, let's open up this floor plan. I'm practically singing this part of the lecture, having a dance party in my own mind, skipping rapidly over ideas that have lived in my limbs and shaped all of my disabled days for the past 3 decades. Isn't this fun? Isn't this life changing? In the middle of my euphoria, I glanced back at my students. The vibe the entire group seemed to have shifted without my noticing. I see squinted eyes, blank faces, scrunched brows, some of them looking entirely skeptical. My heart starts racing, so I talk faster. I hadn't wanted to bring myself into this, but I'm scrambling for something that will make these ideas feel tangible to them. I reach for a simple example from my life and pick out only the most basic facts. Okay, so, for example, when I arrive at school, I'm able to push a button that opens the door. I ride on an elevator to the third floor and enter this room, no problem. I have complete access to the spaces I need to enter. What could have been a disabled experience, the inability to enter a building, has been remedied in this case. They continue to stare back at me with no visible evidence of understanding. Does that make sense? I ask, trying to sound casual, hoping that they're just hiding all signs of comprehension. Yeah, but the disability is still there. It's not like it just disappears, one boy says. I notice how he avoids linking me to the disability itself. I picture the disembodied disability hovering somewhere above me, then diving off to haunt some other unsuspecting body. I see what you're saying. I nod vigorously, wanting so much to affirm my attempt to engage these ideas. What's your name again? I'm still getting to know these kids, still trying to keep all the floppy haired boys straight in my head. Adam, he says. Adam, that's right. Star of the soccer team, Adam. Drives a shiny new sports car to school, Adam. Okay, so Adam brings up an important distinction between disability and impairment. He's right. The impairment of my legs still exists, regardless of elevators or ramps. They don't walk, won't walk, will never walk like others do. And chronic pain makes this tricky too, right? The limitations of pain aren't necessarily solved as easily as attaching a ramp to the side of a building, and in a lot of tangible ways, the impairment is brings debilitates from the inside out. But for now, let's start with the simpler example of a paralyzed person getting to the third floor of a building. When I have an elevator up to our classroom, the need for walking has been eliminated. My paralysis isn't really a problem in this context. I am not limited in any meaningful way as long as I have an accessible route to get there. In fact, right now in this classroom, we're all seated. There's no meaningful difference between my body and yours. The kids look even more confused than they did before. I'm starting to feel like I'm giving a lecture on how the royal family are immortal, shape shifting lizards. The uncertainty I feel from my students makes me question myself. Their resistance to these ideas is disorienting because they're not comprehensively wrong. This is a layer of their narrative that makes sense. There are parts of my body that feel like a problem I'd like to fix. Even as I type this, I'm having a particularly high pain day and my legs won't stop spasming. They jerk and tense, stiffen and shudder, and the computer resting on them keeps getting bumped around. If I'm being perfectly honest, living in this pain is infuriating. I've been working hard to find a way to manage these symptoms, and all of it, the pain, the spasms, the quest for relief, is exhausting. But this layer of truth isn't the one we're focusing on as a class because it's the overwhelming default. It's so much easier to see the one disabled person and say, she needs a cure so she can fit into our world. It's much less common, much harder to recognize. We need to change our world to fit more people. But here's the key. When I trace the most painful threads in my story, when I gather the most defining moments of my life, these legs of mine are not the most debilitating problem, at least not in the ways outsiders expect. When I look back and evaluate the most limiting, painful parts of my life, or even more specifically, the hardest parts about being disabled, is not just my legs. Is just not my legs. It's stigma, isolation, misunderstanding, skepticism, and ubiquitous inaccessibility. And that part right there is the social model, understanding of what it's like to live in an ableist world when you're disabled. Despite all that, my paralyzed legs are the only thing outsiders seem to see. A person is either disabled or not, another floppy haired boy says. His tone is sharper than mere confusion. He sounds irritated, maybe even combative, and his sentiment seems to resonate with others. My head is swirling with 100 ideas and examples and scenarios and questions to push against this common oversimplification, and in an instant, they tangle. I don't understand. If any demographic has the capacity to digest abstract theory and try an alternate ways of looking at the world, I expect it to be the ones sitting in this room. They are members of a generation so much more open to recognizing unique positions of any given identity, an age overwhelmed by unchecked idealism, a distant group of youths known for their intellectual capacity. Am I an awful teacher or just delusional? Has my personal connection to this material totally distorted my ability to think clearly about it? My mind is spinning, but there are 20 sets of eyes on me, all waiting for me to explain myself. Okay, let's try this, I say, trying to keep my voice chipper and casual. Imagine a deaf woman who knows sign language walks into a room full of people signing. In this context, she has every ability to communicate with the group, asking questions, expressing her needs, making jokes. Now imagine that you enter that same room with your hearing ears. Does anyone in here know sign language? They shake their heads no. So when you enter that space, you are the one who lacks access, can't communicate, is on the outside, right? The person sitting in the disabled seat is flipped depending on the context. It just so happens that most spaces are designed for your access, but there are other ways. this could go. But the woman in this scenario still can't hear, Adam insists. I don't see how her lack of hearing could be considered anything other than a deficit, a biological deficit. The thrust of his emphasis, the soreness of his tone, takes my breath away. I'm aware that Adam's in a common point of view. He's inherited from those who put their ideas into motion well before he was born, a legacy none of us has fully escaped. I can almost feel Alexander Graham Bell in the room with us, proposing legislation that could keep deaf mute people from marrying and reproducing in hopes that we could rid the human gene pool of these traits. But this might be the first time someone has argued this position to my face. It's definitely the first time it's been placed before me in a room full of teenagers as I sit with my defected body in front of my carefully crafted slides. Perhaps even more painful than the bit of his words is the silence from the rest of the group. I wait for anyone to challenge him or ask him a follow-up question. They don't, and suddenly I feel extraordinarily alone and dangerously vulnerable. All right, this next little part is just a reflection on what we just read. When I think back on this conversation now, the original loneliness doesn't sting so much. I mean, I was asking a group of very young people to rethink their basic understanding of the world. This was always going to be messy. Most of them had only ever considered disability as a catastrophic tragedy, an unfortunate error. Most of them had little capacity to fathom the gain that can accompany loss. Their response to concepts that remain unwieldy for many intelligent adults happens to bruise my forearms, but I'd invited them into that brawl without wearing any armor. I'd been living in an academic disability bubble, and without realizing it, I had volunteered to burst into a high school among kids who had never had to confront these ideas. Some awful beep was bound to surface. After that lecture, I went home deflated, embarrassed, and full of dread for the months ahead. With only a few hours left in the day before it was time to do it all again, I started frantically revising my lesson plan for the next day. Is there a movie? This would be the point where we transition into a heart-wrenching or ultimately uplifting montage. The music would build toward a victorious crescendo with clips capturing the leap from confusion to enlightenment, hostility to joy, frustration to smooth sailing. After beating her head against the wall, trying to connect with this group of kids, the disabled teacher finds the key. She breaks down their barriers one by one and brings disability to life for this group of students. Finally, after buckets of sweat and tears, she watches as their eyes sparkle with hard-earned recognition. Yeah, it turns out this wasn't a movie. Okay, that's where we're going to stop for today. Thanks for listening.